Welcome to Senate Education, Wednesday, May 11th, 3:15. Thanks for joining us, Mr. Secretary. Mr. Secretary, to summarize some of the conversations we've had, during the day here, catching a minute, catching another minute off the floor, is that we are, I think, a couple of things. We're hearing from people that are concerned about implementing this rule right away. And then we're hearing more and more now from parents and others that want us to implement it. I think it was Senator Perchlik, and I may ask him to just say a couple of words on some of the phone calls he's made and some of the information he's gathered. But in short, I just continue to personally feel like we should not postpone, because it really is the best thing for kids to get this up and off the ground. Act 173 was passed, I think, in 2017, 2018. But Senator Perchlik, would you just maybe say a few words?
Yeah, I think that's where I would start. That Act 173 was passed in 2017. We had a couple of years of delaying it, and a lot of folks in this area feel like there's been one delay after another to provide this change. That Vermont is out of sync with the country on this wait to fail kind of policy that we have to give some students the services that you need an IEP, and that there are some children that do academically well, but have, like emotional and social needs that we can't provide those services because they're not failing academically. In the rest of the country this way, my understanding, this is best practices. The federal government wants us to do this. And even though the schools are under a lot of pressure and a lot of work, that this isn't the place that we should try to relieve that pressure, that this is too important for the children that need these services. And particularly what I heard is these children that might be on the autism spectrum, that might do well academically, so they're not failing classes, but they really need this emotional and social needs help, that this would allow the schools to provide those services that they can't provide now because they're not failing, so they can't get the IEPs. So those are the main thing is, and I just wanted to hear from the agency the kind of the reaction from this, what we're hearing from the teachers and those on the ground, that that this is a problem for them to get started, that they're not ready, that it's going to cause a lot of difficulty and problems in the schools because they're not ready.
Good afternoon. Would you like me to respond?
Yes, respond, please.
Yeah. So for the record, Dan French, Secretary of Education. Yeah, I think, Senators, to both your points, I mean, and what you just summarized has more or less been the main point of my testimony earlier in the session on this. It's, I always try to weigh, firstly, what's best for kids. And I haven't heard anyone say this shift isn't long overdue. On the other hand, I'm a member of the advisory group that was formed under 173. And yes, that work has been delayed. Good work, the regulatory work is essentially concluded at this point. And I feel very positive that we've put a framework in place that's going to be serving the best interests of our students in the future. So the question now is really, from my perspective, a practical one as to what extent districts are prepared to make this transition. And I can say, where I started my thinking on this, which was essentially March, February, after listening to the deliberations of the advisory group, again, of which I'm a member. And they had some split differences on their perspective. But I always feel, especially as a former superintendent principal, to weigh in a bit on the practical levels of implementation. And now that we're essentially 4 weeks away from the end of the school year, I think a strong argument can be made for delaying this more so than previously, just on the practical issues of implementation. And in particular, there is a strong regular ed presupposition, if you will, or focus on the multi-tiered support system. So when you say students might or might not get services because of eligibility determination, I would argue what's anticipated in 173 is a strong structure of tiered supports prior to students becoming eligible, and those students should be getting what they need consistently through moving through sort of that tiers, if you will. That's not uniformly implemented right now across the state. So I think an argument could be made also from the regular ed side that we need to beef up our capacity in a multi-tiered support system. And certainly that's been our goal as relative to the recovery work that we see unfolding in front of us, is to really rely on that structure and to a certain extent put some emphasis on that structure being deployed at the district level as opposed to the school level, so we can bring state resources to bear more effectively, like mental health and so forth. So I think, just to summarize, I support the policy. I think it's what's best for kids. But as a practical matter, it's only 4 weeks away from the school year. If this had gone into law in February, I'd say we'd be in a better place to make that thoughtful transition on July 1. But it's going to be very challenging right now for many school districts to make this transition in the last 4 weeks of the school year, when there's really limited bandwidth available in a good year, let alone in a year that we've experienced this pandemic and where people are motivationally and fatigue wise. It's going to be very challenging.
Thank you, Secretary French, but with all due respect, this is already law. So we're not putting it into law. We would just be allowing the law to continue. So what's being asked of us is to stop the law that's already in place.
I believe this is a matter of regulation, not law. So delaying the implementation of new regulation.
Right, but the regulation's already passed. The laws, the rules, LCAR passed the rule is in place to start on July 1st. So if we do nothing, it'll happen. So it's not, we didn't need to have a law passed to have it happen. So in my view, everybody should have just been assuming that the law that we passed, we meant it, and that when the rule was agreed to go to July 1st, that they meant it, and that the agency was preparing for that, and that everybody should have been saying, well, we want to delay, but we're going to prepare for the law on the books to happen on July 1st. So I'm a little surprised of the testimony on that point, but also I wondered if you could talk at all about the federal supervision that Vermont's special education services are under now, and kind of how you feel like delaying this rule plays into that supervision, and what some people would say is that we're failing some of these special education students in that regard.
Yeah, again, it's a matter of rule, not law per se, and the rules have been going through a very long process. There's been a consistent pattern of adjusting the timelines relative to what's doable and so forth. So again, I'm not in my position as this is what's best for kids, and I'm very thankful and appreciative of the hard work that so many of the stakeholder groups have been given to developing these rules. I am concerned that, essentially this issue has been bounced around a bit inside the General Assembly for the last several months. If it was so clear that this was going to be implemented, then it should have been allowed to go forward without much debate earlier in the session to give us the appropriate runway to implement it. But there's definitely, I think you'd have to concede, there's been mixed messages about delay up until this very minute. So to your point, people should have been preparing, but also people were not clear to what extent it would actually be enacted. In terms of the supervision of special education, we've taken steps, and those steps are essentially expressed most concisely in our budget proposal from the agency. We would like to see more robust capacity to do monitoring of special education. Therefore, I put forward a request for 3 additional positions, grant-funded positions under federal special ed funding, to give the agency more capacity to do that monitoring and to provide that technical support, which I think has lapsed to a certain extent over the last few years. We have a good plan of corrective action to address those issues, but we need to put more effort at the state level to provide technical assistance and the monitoring support to school districts so they don't fall far afield from compliance with the regulation. So I think assuming the budget goes forward, we'll be in a good position to provide that additional support.
Senator Chin.
Secretary French, thank you. I just want to state from the outset, I do support the rule. I think it's the right thing to do for our school districts, and that would still allow school districts that are ready to start early. But my question to you is, should we do nothing and that this rule goes into effect? without any action by the legislature in the remaining hours left of this session, is there a waiver, a process for school superintendents to reach out to the Secretary of Education to say, we're really sorry, but we cannot meet this requirement right now? Does anything exist today where you would be able to use that power, that ability to address the real concerns that I'm hearing a lot about right now?
I don't believe so. I mean, that, again, this issue of a waiver or a piecemeal waiver, I think was brought up in this committee when I originally testified, and I think also in the House Education Committee. I think due to the nature of these rules, that kind of approach would be very problematic. You know, you'd have, and students do move from district to district, so it'd be really challenging to enforce different rules, particularly rules that are associated with student civil rights from one district to another. I'm not sure I would have, or the agency would have the capacity to do that sort of assessment, because essentially, to a certain extent, what we're hearing now is people's, basically signaling they're not ready to do it. That's not necessarily factoring into sort of my testimony today per se, but I think it is fine to say that, look, this policy has been bantered back and forth for the last couple of months, and it's only now in the 11th hour that we're giving some clear direction to the field on how to proceed. And that's inadequate, essentially, that people need a little more time to digest this and figure out how to move forward. And I would prefer to have the system move forward together. I think that's the best approach relative to professional development and training, so we don't have to speak to districts on a piecemeal basis, that we can bring people together across district boundaries and work from the same set of rules. That in my case would be the best scenario possible for our schools. So I think the waiver would be problematic, both from an implementation standpoint, but also at a practical level. I'm not sure we'd have the criteria developed to make that decision accurately.
Thank you.
Senator Persley.
Yeah, I'm surprised that it's changed in the position of the agency, but that aside, what would you recommend? I tell my constituents, these parents that have these children that were denied services, but they feel like once the new rule goes into place and they're not required, their child isn't required to have academic failure to get the services. What I heard you say is that they should be getting the things that they need anyway. What is a parent supposed to do, or what would you recommend that they do to get those services that their children need without the rule in place? What would they need to say to their superintendent that says your child cannot have a behavior specialist because they're not failing because the new rule hasn't got into place? Can you help me at all on what I should tell them, how to advocate for their children without the rule?
Yeah, I think, if you're familiar with the special education qualification process, a parent, a teacher, a district could refer a student for evaluation for special education. And basically what we're talking about is the eligibility criteria by which a student would be eligible for special education. In my experience, when a student is not seen to be eligible for special education, it automatically triggers a 504 process, for an evaluation relative to 504 accommodations. So when a student is found ineligible and there are still needs, whether it be for specialized instruction or additional academic supports or accommodations, it immediately triggers a review of the student situation relative to 504. So again, there are systems in place that will support students. So it's not like students aren't going to be provided services. If students are not eligible, won't be provided their individual education program. But again, where I think I would say we're hoping, especially with the recovery work in front of us, even before the 504 determination, we need to build out capacity to prevent students from falling behind. And that's the MTSS system, which has been not consistently deployed across the state. And that's something we intend to put a lot of focus on relative to recovery, because we need that system to come online more consistently across the state to help us triage and identify the patterns of student need across the state. And when I say need, that is academics, but it's also social emotional needs. It could be mental health needs, but we need to have a better understanding of what the patterns are there as a result of the pandemic. So again, simultaneously with those sort of recovery approach coming online, I think it would be consistent with the delay of this policy, because hopefully what we'll see at the end of this year, and I would go forward with the policy regardless, but what we should see at the end of this year are more robust MTSS general education supports in place more consistently across the state.
Anything else for Secretary French at this point?
I guess
Please, yeah.
one last question is I understand what you're saying, Secretary French, but I wondered about what you see the harm to the children would be of not doing the delay. I understand it's going to be difficult for the districts that haven't had all the training that they might like to have, but is there any harm to the children in going forward with the rule on July 1st as planned?
Yeah, I don't, it's questionable at this point whether the rule could be consistently implemented across the state. So, to what extent students would be able to be identified, to your point, eligible for services, they still have to go through the evaluation process, and that evaluation process in many districts will have to be reconfigured based on this change in rule. And that's the piece. There's already a backlog of referrals, no doubt. This is a time of year where there's normally a lot of a backlog in referrals anyway. Students finish out the year. There's a lot of revals coming up, which happen on a 3-year basis. When the rules change, there's going to be increased pressure on the evaluation process. So it's not clear to me to what extent students would be going through that process in a timely manner anyway, because of the change in rule and its need for having a better understanding across the state. So.
It would be uneven and they'd have to wait, but we're asking them to wait a year if we don't do the rule.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Anything else for the Secretary? Thank you, Secretary French. Appreciate it. Although I feel like this is goodbye for now. I doubt it since we could be here tomorrow.
Well, I look forward to seeing you again. Let me know what I can do to help.
Right. Thanks a million. It looks like there are caucuses going on right now for both parties.